May the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts be acceptable to you, O Lord, our rock and redeemer. Please be seated. Morning, everyone. Today, I ask you to think about dividing lines. Dividing lines separate, differentiate, discriminate, and can build up tension. Today's gospel is about dividing lines. It's a story about Jesus, who is Jewish, and his travel across a border and his interaction with a Syrophoenician woman, a Gentile. So first, let's be clear about these terms. Who were the Jews and Gentiles? The Jewish people descended from the 12 sons of Jacob, 12 tribes of Israel. They lived in the Near East and believed in one God who related to human beings through several sacred covenants or promises. Jewish people followed the law or Torah that was given to Moses, involving diet, purity, the Sabbath. And these practices highly define the Jewish people. The word Gentile came to mean simply a person who was not Jewish. You could define Gentiles by where they were from, for example, the Canaanites or Syrophoenicians. There were Romans and enslaved peoples originating from all over the empire, as bounty after a war, for example. They too were Gentiles. Or you could define the Gentiles by their religions, pagan or Greco-Roman, are examples, or you could define them by what they adhered to in terms of philosophy, like Epicureans or Neoplatonists. It was a very complicated world back then, a time of great diversity like our world now. It was a time of great mixing of people. There were possibilities and problems. The Jewish people, numbering probably several million, were rather isolated from the others because of their strict dietary and purity laws. Because they stayed away from Gentiles, over generations there grew a fundamental distrust between the groups and eventually turning to hatred between the groups. Not to mention there were wars and occupation, first by the Greek army and then the Roman army. And there were groups within Judaism that disagreed with each other, like the Pharisees and Sadducees. So due to mixing resulting from military occupation, commerce, schools, and travel, it was a very different world from the Old Testament. I think of our own world today, seeking the elusive defeat of the global COVID-19 pandemic. Many suffered and still suffer unemployment and economic hardship. Sadly, drug abuse has become rampant. Many children are falling behind in their education. Seniors and the immune compromised are especially isolated. The growth of screens, computer and television, accelerated by as much as 50% in 1 year due to the pandemic. For many, because of these screens, there was a great mixing of people, learning from each other, exploring new ideas, a time of great stretching of ourselves, actually. It was at times difficult to keep up. All of this we learned to do not tied to geographic area. We could try out different teachers or preachers from anywhere in the world. At the same time, with so much available, injustices were revealed. The death toll from the virus was felt disproportionately in communities of color. Word about injustices got around quickly through the news and video because everyone was plugged in. We saw groups rising up against each other, Black Lives Matter versus Blue Lives Matter, and so on. We watched protests erupt in real time, such as at Lafayette Square, the U.S. Capitol. Just last weekend, on the anniversary of Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, we saw protests about voting rights. We witnessed the rise of consciousness raising when it comes to racism meeting sometimes on the internet and sometimes also in the streets, with white people taking more responsibility as they awoke to the problems caused by racism. With all the discussion, it came clear, if it wasn't before, that the transatlantic slavery commerce created more wealth in the U.S. than has ever been known. And even after slavery ended, systemic practices continued, such as Jim Crow, sharecropping, peonage, lynching, and redlining. And more continues today: mass incarceration, voter suppression, and education and health disparities. So many dividing lines. Don't you wonder what will be the impact of this time, which resembles in some way the time of Christ, with problems yet possibilities? How did Jesus handle it? Jesus was a Jewish man with at least a few Gentiles in his long bloodline. For example, Ruth and Tamar were Canaanites. Today's gospel reading comes from the section of Mark depicting the apostles' journeys. Everywhere they went, there were great crowds, as word of Jesus' healing powers got around. Jesus at times tried to get his disciples some rest, zigzagging around, hoping the crowds would not catch up. Sometimes he led his group into Gentile territory in order to retreat. In today's reading, they crossed the border and went to the region of Tyre, a Gentile city on the Mediterranean Sea. There was a great antipathy between the Jews and the people there, the Syrophoenicians, who fought bitterly over the centuries. Yet even here, people had heard of Jesus' powers. The Syrophoenician woman, whose name is not given, comes to Jesus out of fear for her daughter who is not well. We expect Jesus to say, "Of course I will save your daughter." But here Jesus is caught with his proverbial compassion down. He says to her, "Let the children be fed first." He meant let his people, the Jews, receive the teaching first. That is, his mission is to the Jews. And then he said, "For it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." Jesus calls her a dog. This is not nice. Maybe he is reacting to the wealthy Syrophoenicians who were oppressing the minority Jews in the area. Maybe he is feeling the urgency of his message to the Jews, and he has a very human feeling of being overwhelmed that he's being spread too thin. But the Syrophoenician woman does not shrink away. She has a quick comeback. Even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. She pleads for a scrap of Jesus' attention, knowing that even this scrap would be transformative. Her faith in his healing power takes him by surprise. Jesus recognizes the wisdom in her words, and he changes his mind. He realizes that his mission is not just to the Jews. God's love expands beyond the barriers. Rather than scolding her, he says, "You may go, your daughter is healed." These travel stories where Jesus goes to Gentile country portray Jesus in a very particular light. He crosses over religious, ethnic, geographic, and gender barriers in order to make his Father's kingdom present. What I make of this is that there should not be barriers between humans, no matter their physical or mental condition, race, class, ethnicity, gender, age. All people are deemed equally valuable. Perhaps the most important instruction about how Jesus handled the question of the Gentiles and other groups occurred after Jesus' resurrection. In his last words before his ascension to heaven, He commanded his disciples to go therefore and make disciples of all nations. The phrase all nations resonates with God's promise to Abraham over 1,000 years earlier. By your offspring shall all nations of the earth gain blessing for themselves. All nations means all nations. With Jesus gone to the Father, it was then the duty of the disciples to spread his teachings. Just to be clear, there was nothing called Christianity at the time. The Jesus movement was seen by many as yet another sect of Judaism. And there was a huge controversy about whether Gentiles could join the followers of Jesus, who were in large part initially Jewish. On the one hand, one faction wanted the Gentiles to be circumcised and to adopt all the Jewish laws, being essentially converted to Judaism first. On the other hand, the disciple Paul received a vision that he was to teach the Gentiles. He was against this conversion. This was a critical argument as intense as what we are having today about race. But Jesus was clear that his way was to welcome all of humanity, no boundaries. Studying the Gospels as a whole, we know that Jesus stressed at least 4 teachings. 1, he taught us to love our enemies and to be nonviolent. 2, he was angry about the conditions of oppressed people. 3, he was all about inclusion of all peoples. And 4, he emphasized service, as shown by his ministry and epitomized by the washing of the apostles' feet and his self-sacrifice on the cross. Paul and his followers got the Gentiles accepted into the growing Jesus movement, and the disciples' roles then took them throughout the world, spreading the good news even to Gentile countries. So many of us were welcomed to Christianity through our Gentile ancestors. Paul writes, in his flesh, Jesus has made both groups into one and has broken down the dividing wall, that is, the hostility between us. So we are called to follow the example of Jesus. What boundaries do we allow to prevent us from being true to this calling? What groups do we consciously or subconsciously exclude due to our own lack of awareness? Do we allow racist, sexist, nationalist, or heterosexist attitudes to cloud our assessment of the value of those who belong to groups different from our own? How can we better follow this example of Jesus, to love someone different from us, to fight to improve the conditions of oppressed people, to extend welcome to those different from us, and to bring a spirit of service to those we encounter? It's a complicated time. There are problems, yes, but possibilities also. Bishop Stephen Charleston is a Native American of the Choctaw people. He's a bishop in our church. He writes, one of the reasons I like history is because it reminds me that things have always been a mess. Our dysfunction as the human family is nothing new. Racism and bigotry, poverty and war, greed and corruption, and the 1,000 other ways we injure one another and the planet have been with us since the beginning. So just when I considered despair as a viable option in the face of our sad old world, I perk up thinking about how many generations of us have stubbornly fought against these injustices. I realize that I am standing on the shoulders of generations of faithful advocates and activists. So yes, things are still a mess. But no, I am not giving up for a second in my fight for hope. I am staying with the people who want to make history, not just read about it. Let it be so. Amen.